So let's talk about some other insurance products that we have out there, because they become a very important part of the program. We talk about the preferred risk policy. In the preferred risk policy, it is similar to preferred auto, where you have no tickets, no accidents, no underage drivers, no sports cars. You could get a preferred risk rate for that. Well, the same thing applies to the preferred risk flood policy. Limited flood exposure cannot be located in a special flood hazard area. It's a package policy based on the amount of coverage we have for the building. We'll give you contents automatically. It's issued under the dwelling form or under the general property form. It is not eligible for the RCBAP. So it's just for non-residential and residential properties. It's a lower premium with minimum history, lower risk zone, and it covers up to $250,000 building and $100,000 in contents. Must be located in a BC or X zone. Now, when we change our flood maps, now and in the future, and we increase the risk for properties that used to be located in non-special flood hazard areas, BC and X, now they're being moved into a special flood hazard area, we have a new rating program which is about 15% more than the preferred risk. So you move from a non-special flood, non-high risk, to a high risk. You go to an A zone or even a V zone. We use the term grandfather, but it's really our new terms are called newly mapped. So you move into the newly mapped procedure. So it's done automatically by the company when the map changes, and it's about 15% more. There's also a product called the group flood insurance policy. In the group flood insurance policy, that is only for recipients of disaster assistance through FEMA. And what FEMA does is provide a 3-year policy. We take $600 out of the grant and provide flood coverage for 3 years up to the amount of the grant for that period, for that term. And at the end of that 3-year period, the property owner is required to obtain and maintain flood insurance for the life of the property. So we provide notice to the recipient of the group flood insurance policy, both at initial, every annual, and then prior to the expiration of the 3 years, advising them that they must obtain flood insurance, and if they don't, they will not get future disaster assistance. This is the law that was created in 1994 after Midwest floods that said we really need to provide some way of them to buy flood insurance for recipients of the grant. Of course, they can buy flood insurance anytime they want to. They just need to contact their insurance agent and get a flood policy based on the risk, based on the documentation. When they do that, for higher limits than they can have under the group flood policy, that group flood policy then becomes null and void. So let's talk about building eligibility. In order to be eligible for the NFIP, you must have a structure that's got 2 or more outside rigid walls and a roof. We insure manufactured homes or travel trailers if they're affixed to a permanent foundation and anchored. We insure single, family, 2 to 4, other residential, non-residential, both business, and other non-residential. Other non-residential could be public buildings. We insure buildings in the course of construction, Building may not even be there, and we'll write a flood policy on it, because if you remember under the mandatory purchase, located or to be located, needs to have flood insurance for that loan closing. We can provide coverage for a building in the course of construction. It includes additions and extensions. We consider a single building if it's attached by a roof line, or a stairway, or an elevated walkway, or a solid exterior wall. Has to be principally above ground and not entirely over water. They float away. Contents eligibility has to be inside a fully enclosed building or secured to prevent flotation out of the building. You got a three-sided garage with no front to garage door. In order for us to cover the contents, they have to be secured and stay within that garage. We will also insure silos, grain storage, buildings, barns, cisterns, as part of the National Flood Insurance Program. We will insure motorized vehicles that maintain the building. Lawnmower is a prime example of that. We will also insure motorized vehicles that assist the handicap. However, those have to be inside the insured building and unlicensed. So let's look at some examples of risk. As you see on the graphic here, you've got an elevated building. You have what may be condominiums, probably in Miami. You have barns. You have buildings under the course of construction. So these are some examples of eligible risks. So what's not eligible for coverage? Well, we don't insure buildings that have been declared ineligible by the community under Section 1316 of the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. Those buildings are ones that are built in non-compliance. The property owner will not bring them into compliance. And the community has to go through a penalty process to declare them 1316s. They send them to FEMA. FEMA puts them in a database, and then we do not allow flood insurance to be written on those properties until they are brought in compliance, and the community requests them to be taken off of the list. We don't insure gas or liquid storage tanks. They don't meet the definition of a building. Remember, that was 2 walls and a roof, principally above ground, as the definition of a building. Buildings entirely over water. We can insure buildings partially over water, but there are some underwriting requirements of when they were built and whether they're partial. So check with the flood insurance manual to find out those requirements. Buildings 50% below grade. There's a lot of areas in this country now where those are becoming very popular. You have structures being built into hills. Those would not be eligible for coverage under the National Flood Insurance Program. We have limited coverage for contents and building items in basements, regardless of the flood zone, or in elevated buildings, in special flood hazard areas, in high-risk flood zones that begin with the letter A or the letter V. Again, consult the manual or consult the insurance policy for those limitations. There are only 17 building items and 3 content items that are covered in basements or in enclosures. So in the graphic that we're showing now, what is the eligibility for those 4 types of structures? You've got the greenhouse. Would they be eligible for coverage? Yes, they would, because it's 2 walls, rigid, and a roof, principally above ground, would be an eligible structure. The gazebo, not a walled structure, so that would not be eligible. The recreational vehicle, This particular one shown would not be, but you may have a trailer or travel trailer that people now are using as their homes. And if they are, and they are secured, anchored, and mitigated to communities' floodplain management requirements, we can insure them. The fourth picture on there is the building in the course of construction. So yes, we can insure those even before they're walled and roofed. However, there is a limitation to that under the policy. If it's not walled and roofed, it has a double deductible. And the other qualification is if construction stops for more than 90 days, so does the coverage. We don't insure plants, we don't insure animals, we do not insure driveways, walkways, sea walls, retaining walls. We cover what is within the perimeter foundation of that building. The lawnmower, that's one of the covered motorized vehicles, as long as it is in the enclosed building on the property. Buildings over water, not entirely over water, no. As I said, they tend to float away. Partially over water, it depends on when they were built. So consult the date of construction compared to what we have in the manual to see if they're eligible for coverage, or check with your underwriter.